Hello everybody, this is Jeff Janess and welcome to our third lecture introducing you to ArcGIS Pro. The first lecture we discussed GIS in general and just some of the cool things you could do. And second lecture we looked at the large family of software that makes up ArcGIS. And this lecture we're going to look specifically at ArcGIS Pro. If you like, this might be a good time to open up the ArcGIS Pro project called WallowFire. It's in your class data folder in the WallowFire folder. Just double-click on this file, wallowfire.aprx, and that way you can try out some of the ArcGIS Pro functions as I described them here. And we might as well start out with discussing what exactly a project is. When you run ArcGIS Pro, you're considered to be running a project. This project has links to lots of components that are actually separate from the project itself, such as spatial datasets, maps, tools, and some specialized items that help you do analysis or create attractive maps. There's a lot of things you can bring into your project that actually exist out in the cloud or on your hard drive or network somewhere, and it's a little different than when you're running, say, Microsoft Word or Excel. In those cases, everything you see in the software window is contained in that file, but ArcGIS Pro is a little more complicated than that. You're running ArcGIS Pro, and you're using ArcGIS Pro to interact with lots of other datasets and tools scattered around the hard drive or the network. When you look at the project location using Windows File Explorer, you see several files and folders. And these files and folders, they're all stuff that tell ArcGIS Pro what should be included in this particular project. And it's generally a wise idea not to mess around with any of these files or folders using Windows File Explorer, other than to double-click on the APRX file to actually open the project. All of these folders you see here contain parts and pieces of the overall ArcGIS Pro project, and if you mess with any of them, you'll probably just corrupt the project and it won't open anymore. Now, when you start ArcGIS Pro, it either opens to an existing project or creates a new one. If you double-click on this file, WallowFire APRX, well, it'll open that Wallow file project directly, and in general, when you double-click an APRX file, ArcGIS will open that project, and you can go to work right where you left off when you last saved the project. On the other hand, if you start using ArcGIS Pro by getting to it from the Start menu or something, then it'll offer to load a previous project that you were working on, or it will offer to create a brand new project. If you want to open a new project, then you have a couple of options. ArcGIS Pro will offer to start with a new empty map catalog or scene if you like. Just choose one of these options up here. And if you choose any of these options, it will ask you where to save your project, and then it will create all those project files and folders on your hard drive in the location that you specify. Now, sometimes you don't want to have all these files appear on your hard drive. Sometimes you just want to do some quick analysis, maybe take a quick look at some data. In this case, you don't need or want to permanently create hundreds of new files on your hard drive. So you want your ArcGIS Pro session just to be temporary. You don't plan to return to it. Now, in this case, you can choose this option, Start Without a Template, and ArcGIS Pro will open in a temporary location. Now, it'll still create all those files and folders because Pro needs them to run, but they'll all be deleted as soon as you close the software. Now, this phrase, Start Without a Template, it only means that it won't create a new empty map, scene, or catalog view when it opens, but those are easy to create manually once your project is open. And actually, the Esri software developers probably could have named this option Open Temporary Project, and it would have been more intuitive. And once your new project is open, you just go to the Insert tab and you click New Map, and then you'll have your new map to work in. And by the way, if you choose this option to start without a template and you're working in a temporary project, well, you can change your mind later and decide to save it permanently. It's easy to do. You just hit the Save button and ArcGIS Pro will save all the files permanently. Now let's look at the software. ArcGIS Pro uses this thing called the ribbon. It shows different tools depending on what you currently have open and selected in your project. Now, this means that if we have a map selected and open, then we'll see lots of tools that apply to maps. Each tab at the top opens a new set of tools, and so if we click this Map tab, then we'll see this clipboard, the Navigate, Layer, etc. tools available to us. When we switch to the Analysis tab, we'll see a bunch of analytical tools pop up, and the same goes for all these other tabs. Furthermore, if we select one of our layers in the map, we'll see even more tabs appear that only apply to the specific type of data we've selected. We're going to learn more about vector and raster data in another lecture, but we have both types loaded into this map. So if we select one of the vector layers, we'll see new tabs for feature layer, labeling, and data appear. These apply to vector datasets. If we select a raster data, we'll see new items for raster layer and data appear, and these apply to raster datasets. If there are a few tools you'd like to have quick access to, you can also add them up to this quick access toolbar. For example, when I zoom in or out of a map, I like to have quick access to the tools that let me go back and forth through my extents. ArcGIS Pro puts these tools inside the Map tab, so if I'm in any other tab, I have to click several items to get back to my previous extent. Therefore, I have added these tools to my quick access toolbar to let me do it more efficiently. Unfortunately, there's not much room up here for very many tools, but you can at least add a few, and we'll go over how to do that in one of the lab exercises. Now, speaking of modifying the basic interface and functionality of ArcGIS Pro, the software also has a large number of options you can set that affect how the software behaves. If you click the Project tab here, then go down to Options, you can change how ArcGIS Pro does several things. For example, when you add a new map, ArcGIS Pro usually likes to add a base map automatically. And personally, this kind of annoys me because I don't like the software making assumptions about what I want in my map. So I set my base map option to be none. So now when I add a new map, it opens as a blank map, which is much better for me. And there's lots of these kind of options that you can set for yourself that make ArcGIS Pro work better for you. Now, into ArcGIS Pro itself. ArcGIS Pro does lots of things. It's a tool for managing data, for analyzing data, and that's actually my favorite part, and it's a tool for presenting and displaying data. So let's start by looking at each of these. For managing data, ArcGIS Pro includes this catalog view, which lets you manipulate data in your hard drive or on the network. Esri actually provides another much more sophisticated tool for managing data called ArcGIS Enterprise. This is another one of those items in the larger family of ArcGIS software. You'd use ArcGIS Enterprise if you're maintaining and distributing data for lots of users. You know, maybe if you're the U.S. Forest Service, or maybe if you're a city or a county GIS department. But for personal use, this ArcGIS Pro catalog tool is sufficiently powerful for most individual purposes. Using this tool, we can navigate to all the places we get data from, we can search databases, we can copy, move, or delete data, and we can add data to maps. We'll talk more about data types and geodatabases in another lecture, but for now, just know that you can use this catalog to search for and find your data. Now, for viewing and analyzing data, ArcGIS Pro gives us maps, and there's two kinds of maps we usually work with. First, lets us view the data from a traditional map perspective, as if the data were flat and we're looking straight down at it. This type of map is equivalent to the paper maps that many of us are familiar with. And in ArcGIS Pro, these things are actually called maps, and we can zoom in and out of them, we can turn layers on and off, and we can symbolize the data in ways that are meaningful for us. Now, ArcGIS Pro also gives another type of map called a scene, which lets us look at the same data from a three-dimensional perspective. Now, using these scenes, we can fly through landscapes or look at three-dimensional objects. There's actually two kinds of scenes. There's a local scene and a global scene. And the main difference between these two is that the global scene draws the map over the curved surface of the Earth, while the local scene draws the data over a flat plane. If you zoomed in close to the surface, these two look almost identical. But if you want to show a large region draped onto an actual sphere, then you'll want to use the global scene. Now, for most projects looking at smaller areas, though, the local scene actually works a little better. And finally, for presenting and displaying data, ArcGIS Pro gives us the layout. This is where we practice our cartographic skills, making anything from quick map images to stick in a report, up to true works of art. Layouts are where we add not only our map, but also legends, scale bars, north arrows, all the other cartographic extras that make a good map. We can even add multiple maps into a layout. We often do this to show multiple perspectives of an area, or to show where the focal area sits within the larger landscape. Now, the layout view is really designed to let us arrange map elements into an attractive final image, not really for changing stuff within a map itself. We can turn layers on and off in a layout, but we can't zoom in and out to different maps. We can't add new layers. However, we can do what they call activate a map from the layout, and when we do that, we get all the map tools back that we would normally see if the map itself were open. We activate a map by selecting that map and either clicking the Layout tab and then the Activate tool, or we can just right-click on the map in the Contents pane and choose Activate. When we're done making our changes, we click the Layout tab and then Close Activation. We'll be back to our ribbon of Layout tools. And by the way, if you want to export your layout to a final image, you can't have any maps activated. You have to close the activation before the Export Layout tool is even available. Okay, now let's look closer at more parts of the ArcGIS Pro interface. All three of the items we've looked at so far, the catalog, the maps, and the layout, they all have this item called the Contents Pane. And in Maps and Scenes, this Contents Pane shows the data you're working with in the map. You can have both spatial and non-spatial data in your map. The spatial data shows up like you'd expect in the map, but you can also load tables of data that don't have any spatial component. We often load tables like this when they contain data that can be connected to spatial data in some way. For example, we might have a dataset showing the locations of something we're interested in, such as the locations of springs across the landscape. These springs are important water sources for both people and wildlife, and various folks like to do regular surveys on them to check their condition. Then we can quickly get the survey history on each spring by connecting our table of surveys to the spring features. Now, in Layouts, this Contents pane shows all the spatial data, plus a list of all the other cartographic elements in your layout. For example, you can find and edit the legend, the north arrows, the scale bars in your layout, as well as all the maps and the spatial data visible in the maps. Now, when looking at both maps and layouts, you have options on how you sort the items in the Contents pane. In Maps, we often choose this first option. It's List by Drawing Order. This means that the items at the bottom of the list draw first in the map, and the items higher in the list draw over the top. This is why we see the wallow burn severity data drawn over the top of the gray topographic relief map. Then we have the roads drawn on top of the burn severity, and we have the fire boundary drawn on top of everything. We can also sort our data by data source, meaning that we see the layers organized by where they are stored on the hard drive or on the network. We can also list them by whether they're selectable or not. We'll get into selections in a future lecture. Basically, this means that you can pick and choose the items in the data set that you want to analyze or map, and there's lots of tools to help you do this. But sometimes we only want to set a few data sets to be selectable, so this option lets us do that. And if any features are selected, then this option will also tell us how many features in each dataset are selected. We can also edit and create data in ArcGIS Pro. It's not just a tool for viewing data. This option here lets us set certain layers to be editable. This helps us to avoid accidentally modifying a dataset that we don't want to edit. This option here to sort by snapping, it's also related to editing data. We're going to get a lot more into that in a future lecture. But basically, there are times when we want to create a new feature, maybe a road or a trail that perfectly connects with an existing feature. And this option lets us set rules on how to do that. This Sort by Labeling option is kind of a specialized function for advanced labeling. Now, we often want labels to appear on our map, such as highway numbers on these roads, maybe street names or county names. And this Sort by Labeling option lets us generate complex rules for creating these labels. And you might get additional options depending on any extensions you have licensed. Remember the discussion of extensions in the last lecture? So if you licensed one of them called Image Analyst, then you'll get this option to sort by aerial images that show the landscape from kind of an oblique perspective. So this is just an example of additional tools that appear when you have different extensions licensed. We also have sorting options for layout contents, so we switch to our layout, look at the contents pane, and now we see we can sort these things by drawing order, just like with maps. You can also group them by the type of cartographic element they are, such as maps or legends, and you can also just look at the map data without being distracted by other cartographic elements. For the catalog, this Contents pane shows the various places you can look for data. In particular, you'll see all the components that are currently connected to this particular project. In this Maps section, for example, we can see all the maps we've got loaded in our project so far. If we close a map, we can quickly reopen it by going to this section here. Same applies to layouts here in the Layouts tab. ArcGIS Pro also requires that you tell the project what databases, hard drive folders, or online servers you want to have access to. We'll go over that in more detail on our lecture on spatial data types, but here's where you'll find them. This whole portal section gives you access to a few online data sources, and if you're logged into an organization that provides data through ArcGIS Online or Portal, then you'll see those data here. You can also access all the publicly available ArcGIS Online and Living Atlas data, and some of these data sources are good, not all of them. Remember that many of these are just provided by anybody who wants to post data, and not everybody's careful about providing accurate and well-documented data, so just be careful with these, but they're kind of fun to search through. Now, I just mentioned that if you close a map, you can reopen it by coming to this project section in the catalog. Now, if you close the catalog view itself, you can reopen it by clicking on the View tab up here in the ribbon, and then click on the Catalog View command. Now, one thing you might notice about this Contents pane is that you can drag it off ArcGIS Pro so it's a separate object, and then you can drag it back and have it stick to one of these arrows. This behavior is called docking, and ArcGIS Pro just loves these dockable windows. Some might even say they've gone a little overboard on them, but maybe you'll like them. With a few exceptions, almost everything you open in ArcGIS Pro presents itself as a dockable pane or dockable window. If you want to change the symbology of a layer, for example, the symbology tools are on their own dockable pane. This symbology pane is actually attached to the currently selected layer, so if you click on a different layer, the symbology pane will shift itself to show information on that new layer. Any of the analytical tools open in a pane, and the list of tools itself opens in a dockable pane. And these panes can stack over each other, so you can switch from one to the other using these little tabs at the bottom. And if you open a table, that's also a dockable window. Now, personally, I like to keep tables as separate windows so they don't interfere with my map extent, but even then they'll dock to ArcGIS Pro if I want them to. Now let's look at some mapping functions. The first thing we're going to look at is scale. I suspect that map scale is pretty intuitive for most of us. Most of us know if we're looking at a map that's a 1 to 24,000 scale, and that means that 1 inch on the map is equal to 24,000 inches on the ground. There's a couple things to understand about how ArcGIS is treating it, though. First off, the scale that we see in the map view, like we see here, well, this scale is only an approximate scale. That's because the map is located on your computer monitor. ArcGIS doesn't really know how big your monitor is. If your monitor was twice as large, and consequently the map on your screen was twice as large, then this scale value would still be the same, and clearly that's not accurate. Now when we shift over to a layout view, now notice how the scale reflects the true scale of the selected map as it is positioned on the layout. You might notice that the scale value is very different when we look at the same map in the layout. Scale value is exact and accurate in the layout because ArcGIS knows exactly how big the layout is. We can even see the rulers around the edge of the layout window that show exactly how large the layout is. And since ArcGIS knows exactly how large the map itself is positioned on the layout, ArcGIS can now report the accurate scale. And also notice how we can click on different maps in the Contents pane and we see the correct scales of each of these. Now you may have heard the terms large scale versus small scale, and the definitions of these terms sound obvious, but they're really not. In cartography, the terms large and small scale are not intuitive, and most people get these terms mixed up. In cartography, a large-scale map is one that is zoomed in close, and a small-scale map is zoomed out. Therefore, a large-scale map shows a smaller area than a small-scale map. That means that this wall of fire is at a larger scale than the map of Arizona and New Mexico. One way to help remember this is to consider the scale values as a fraction. If you see a scale of 1 to 24,000, think of it as 1 over 24,000. 1 over 24,000 is a larger number than 1 over a million, and therefore a 1 to 24,000 scale map is a larger scale than a 1 over a million map. You might also think of it as the relative size of the feature in a map. If a feature looks large, then the map has a large scale. If you change the scale to make the feature look small, then you have given the map a smaller scale. And I've noticed that people who do know the correct definition of scale in cartography often get a little cranky when other people use the wrong definition. And unfortunately, so many people get these terms confused that even if you use the correct definition, many people are going to misunderstand what you're saying. If you show them two maps and you verbally refer to the larger scale one, many members of your audience are going to think you're talking about the other map. Honestly, it's a reasonable mistake to make. In most contexts, large scale means the larger object. If you're an architect, a skyscraper is a larger scale object than a shed, and Therefore, I recommend you try to avoid these terms, large scale and small scale, if there's any chance your audience does not understand the correct definitions of the terms. Why create confusion when it's not necessary? Come up with some other creative way to refer to the map. Maybe describe it in terms of the region it covers, or use terms zoomed in or zoomed out. Just steer clear of large versus small scale if you can. Another interesting feature here we have in the map window is the map coordinates section. All spatial data have coordinates that place them on the landscape. These coordinates are actually what makes the data spatial. And if you move your mouse around, you see the coordinates of your mouse location on the landscape. You may wonder what these units mean, and we're going to go deep into exactly that topic when we discuss projections and datums. But for the meantime, these numbers represent the location using the coordinate system of this map. If our map were in latitude and longitude units, then these numbers would be degrees, latitude, and longitude. If our map were in a universal transverse Mercator coordinate system, then these numbers would be easting and northing values. As I said, we're going to cover this topic thoroughly when we discuss projections and datums. If we switch to the layout view, notice that the coordinates now describe the mouse position on the layout page itself. Units are typically inches or centimeters in this case, depending on how you got ArcGIS Pro set up. If you want to get the map coordinates of your mouse from the layout, then you're going to need to activate the map like we discussed earlier. Notice how the coordinates change. Then we need to close the activation to return to our layout tools. Next up, I'd like to talk about layers. These layers represent the spatial data sets we've got loaded up into our map. They're a little more complicated than they sound. One important fact to remember is that a layer is not the data. You may see the data in your map, but the data set is not necessarily stored in the project itself. Maybe out on the hard drive or the network somewhere, or stored out on the internet. This layer thing that you see here is just a set of instructions telling ArcGIS Pro where the data set is and how to draw it in the map. If you delete this layer from the map, that has no effect whatsoever on the dataset itself. It's still out there. All you're doing is telling ArcGIS Pro to not show the data. If you actually want to delete a spatial dataset, then you should use the catalog view to find it and delete it. And a layer can actually contain other layers. These things are called group layers, and they allow you to turn the entire group on and off if you want. You can also collapse the entire group in the Contents Pane too. It kind of helps you keep your layers organized. And you can even save a layer to the hard drive. And in this case, you create a file that has the extension .lyrx. And just like a layer of the map, the layer file does not store the actual data. It just contains instructions on where to find the data and how to draw it. When you load that layer into a new map, it gets loaded up with all the symbology you previously had set. This is a nice feature. You can spend hours symbolizing a dataset if you really want it to look a particular way. And saving the layer file makes it much easier to preserve your work. If you save a group layer as a layer file, then loading up that group layer will bring in all the layers in the group. And ArcGIS Pro has lots of cool options when you display the data. We're going to get more into this when we discuss cartography, but one really cool drawing rule is called scale dependency. We use this option when we want to display the data differently at different scales. We can even show the same data set differently at different scales. Maybe you only want labels if you're zoomed way into the map. Maybe you only want to show the most important portions of the data when you're zoomed way out. For example, if we had a data set of all the streets in Flagstaff, they'd kind of look like a big blob if we just showed the entire data set. This example shows the same dataset symbolized several different ways, so if we're zoomed way out, then it only shows the major streets. If we zoom in, it shows all the streets and adds labels. And each layer is set to only show at a particular scale. This is what we mean by scale dependency. Whether a layer is visible or not depends on the scale of the map. Notice that all the layers are turned on. They all have little check marks here, but most of them have grayed out check marks. Only the layer with the black check box will draw, and that's because that's set to draw at the current scale of the map. And to check what the scale dependency rules are for each layer, we just open up the layer properties for that layer and look in the General tab. Another cool drawing rule you can set is transparency, and I use this one a lot. For example, I love showing topography, but it can be difficult to show both the shape of the land and some sense of relative elevation. This dataset DEM Wallow, it shows elevation, and in fact DEM actually stands for Digital Elevation Model. You can easily see what the high and low elevations are based on the color we're symbolizing the layer with. Now, however, the actual shape of the land is not really easy to see in this data. For the shape of the land, we want this thing called a hillshade. Hillshade is a type of data set where we imagine the sun is in some location in the sky. Then we color the location based on how directly it faces the sun in three-dimensional space. If it faces the sun directly, we color it white. If it faces away from the sun, we color it black, and anywhere in between, we color in shades of gray. The end result is a great way to visualize the shape of the land. But here we've lost the relative elevation. We can't tell from the hillshade whether this area up here or this down here is at a higher elevation. They're all kind of the same color of gray. Transparency lets us visualize both of these data sets at the same time. So I can set the DEM to be partially transparent so I can see the hillshade underneath. And the result is a hillshade with colors that represent elevation. It's a really powerful and cool function. Now here's another interesting type of layer, the Basemap layer. Esri provides several online datasets called Basemaps, which sometimes provide some attractive backgrounds, or they help you orient and place yourself on the landscape. You can load these by clicking the Basemap button. You can't do much analytically with these things, and you can't change the symbology at all, but they are nice, easy datasets to load, and some of them look pretty good. ArcGIS only lets you load one at a time using this Basemap button for some reason, but there's ways you can load multiple ones if you ever need to. We're going to see how to connect to the ArcGIS Basemaps server directly when we get to our lecture on spatial data types. And when you do this, you can load multiple basemaps at once. Then you can set them to be scale dependent. So, for example, you only see the imagery at one scale and a more generalized map at a different scale. There are lots of additional datasets we can load directly from the internet. When we get to the lecture on spatial data types, we're going to see how to connect to any of thousands of independent data servers available out there. But for right now, you can load any of a very large number of datasets available in ArcGIS Online. And I mentioned these before, pointing out that ArcGIS Online does come in variable qualities, and quite often you think you found the perfect dataset, but it turns out you have no way to judge the accuracy, or you find that the people who posted the data have restricted it in some way that you can't actually do anything interesting with it. There are a lot of great datasets available as well. One of my favorites is the USGS topographic maps, which you can load by searching for USA Topomaps. This dataset looks the best at around 1 to 24,000 scale. You might actually recognize it if you've ever worked in the natural resources field. It's one of the most commonly used maps in natural resources management, or at least in the United States. There's also lots of datasets out there that you can download directly off the internet right onto your hard drive. These are really nice because they don't depend on a fast internet connection, and even better, they let you modify and manipulate the data in ways you just can't if you're reading data from ArcGIS Online. And since I work a lot on the National Forest in the United States, I often download data from the U.S. Forest Service. I also use streams and rivers from the National Hydrography dataset. And I work a lot with human population data that I can get from the U.S. Census site. And Landfire is a wonderful dataset describing vegetation types and canopy cover across the U.S. All of these sources let you download the data directly, and then you can do whatever you want with it. And as I mentioned before, you can log directly into other people's GIS data servers and load their data right into your map. We're going to see how to do this in our lecture on spatial data types, but here I am logging in directly to the state of Arizona's GIS data. Lots of cool data sets here. If I ever need to know the exact locations of the highway mileposts in Arizona, I can find it right here. All right, now we've gone on for quite a while here. I think that'll do for a brief introduction to the ArcGIS Pro Interface. The lab exercises are going to help you become more familiar with what we've been going over. One quick last note, for those of you who are comfortable with keyboard shortcuts, ArcGIS Pro has quite a lot of them built in, and you can see them at this website. For example, you can easily zoom into a rectangle in your map by just holding down the Shift key and drawing a box. It kind of saves you time searching around for commands to click on. All right, thanks so much, everybody. I'll see you in the lab exercises. You take care.